Everyone. We're about to start the session on that on national issues around climate change. We've got a really great set of presenters today, and if everyone else could mute their mics. I'm getting a horrible feedback from someplace. Okay, that seems to be much better. So anyway, as Tip O'Neill, the Speaker of the House in the United States, said, all politics is local. That was his famous quote. All climate mitigation is local. So I want to begin a session in which we talk about how we implement climate policies around the world. And I'm going to begin with our first speaker and turn over the floor to Masahiro and ask him to begin with his presentation on the EMF 35 of the JMIP study for Japan's long-term climate energy policy scenarios, designs, and overview. And Masahiro, I'm going to turn the floor over to you and let you take the screen. Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks. So this is a work with a number of different many collaborators, and I'm going to talk about EMF 35 JMIP study. And so I would like to acknowledge my funder, the Ministry of the Environment in Japan, specifically the Environmental Research and Conservation Agency. So here's some background. So everything is local, as Jay said, and so let me remind you of the Japanese situation. So we have for 2030, you have a 26% emissions reduction goal as a national NDC, and for mid-century strategy, we used to have 80% emissions reduction by 2050. And the new Prime Minister Suga, he made in his inaugural speech in the Parliament or Diet, he made a pledge to carbon neutrality or GHG neutrality in by 2050 in 2 months ago, and we're gonna actually cover most 80% emissions reduction, but we'll touch on the 100% emission reduction briefly. And if we look at the Japanese literature, basically there was no model intercomparison project with sensitivity analysis on technology. Oshiro et al., they, as part of CD links, they address sensitivity and emission constraints with a multi-model framework. But we are going to present you the multi-model analysis of the 80% reduction with lots of sensitivity analysis on technology, mostly. So here's an overview of EMF 35, and just like other EMF the project, so we have John Wyant on board, and here you see the so why we need this kind of study. This is because I think each country faces unique challenges and unique opportunities, and next slide I will explain our unique challenge. But we have less renewable energy resources endowments, and there are some special feature about industry, and we have 5 models. I will explain that more in later. And we are working hard to complete our project. And today I'm going to focus mostly on the policy and the technology aspects, but we have actually more analysis on renewables and industry decarbonization in electrification. So let me take a few minutes to explain Japan's unique situation. First of all, our renewable energy endowments are less compared to other countries. So this is actually a study led by Pick and Gunnar. But so if you look at the upper right corner, so this is the how much electricity demand can be met with the solar photovoltaic technology. And Japan, this is almost like an anomaly. This simply affects the fact that Japan has high population density, and because if you contrast our demand against our area and also the potential solar PV generation, basically demand exceeds the power generation from solar PV a lot. So it's just a simple fact, but this will create a huge challenge for deep mitigation to Japan, obviously. And here I'm showing the results, their analysis for solar PV, but the situation is similar for wind as well. On the demand side, we have another challenge here. So on the down here, you see the final energy consumption by sector, and Japan is here. And they're actually the different countries, but this is G20 average, and this is G7 average. And Japan still prides itself as Japan prides itself as a country of manufacturing, and our final consumption in the industry sector is large. And also, obviously, the emissions from the industry sector is large. We have thriving steelmaking industry, petrochemicals, and cement, and these emit lots of emissions of it. And so this is one of the hard to decarbonize sectors, and we have to confront this issue. So I think this is the motivation for model into comparison project for Japan, and I think this is I think a lot of other countries also face its unique challenges, but we analyzed the case of Japan. So we have 5 models. 4 of them are bottom-up models, and one is the CG from the AIM Hub. 2 are myopic and 3 are intertemporal. We have harmonized some input parameters, so population and GDP growth rate. We use 2 scenarios for GDP growth rate. One is consistent with the Japanese government plan, and actually it is sometimes criticized as too high. And we also use SSP2 as our GDP growth rate, and you can think of it as a lower demand scenario. And I haven't presented the scenario setting. I will explain more later. But we have about 50 scenarios or so, both in terms of cost and the technology. So let me share with you our results. So this, so I simply presenting the sectoral emissions. So electricity, transport, buildings, and industry, including the industrial processes. Actually, the one thing to mention now is, so this is a hub. It's a CG model, computer general equilibrium model. So it actually changes its own economic structure, and the behaviors are slightly different from other models. And other models like AIM end use and IEJ time Japan, and actually DNA 21, which is not shown here, they are bottom-up models. So the behaviors are different, and that's something to keep in mind. And let's pay attention to this median. So you can see the median value increases from left to right. So electricity, obviously, it gets completely decarbonized by 2050, and transportation, buildings, industry, that's the order. And it is the industry that is hard to decarbonize in Japan. And our emissions are actually dominated by energy-related CO2 emissions, energy and also industrial CO2 emissions. And we have actually relatively fewer emissions from the sectors like agriculture. And this industry will dominate the residual emissions in 2050 under the 80% emissions reduction. I haven't touched on this ribbon, but this ribbon describes the ranges of 4 scenarios: default, no nuclear, no CCS, and a lower GDP growth based on SSP2. This is just an attempt to summarize the mitigation strategy Japan could take. So, and here again, the scheme, the ribbon, it's the same as the previous slide. So you see here energy intensity of GDP, obviously it decreases for all the models and for all scenarios. The same is true for power sector emissions. And electrification will accelerate in the future, but this MHub has a huge acceleration because of actually industrial sector. Things are a bit different for the lower parts, although quantitatively things are similar for variable renewable energy, the penetration rate, and the fossil fuel share. So the depends on the model. Like I said, Japan has fewer renewable energy resources. So of course, we will employ a lot more variable renewables, but the penetration rate might be lower than the United States or Europe or other parts of the world. But still, of course, this is going to be important. This reflects the different levels of a CCS application. So, and I'm not going to go into the detail. The things are a bit complicated for the industry. So to make it simple, there are 2 futures. One is so Japan could change its economic structure, and then maybe we will have a lesser presence of heavy industry, or we could retain about the same level of heavy industry with maybe different technologies, but still the heavy industry is going to be important. And if that's the case, the industry share in finite energy will slightly increase or fairly increase by 2050. And this is going to be a challenge for deep decarbonization if we decide to go deeper than 80%. Actually, the government made such a comment, the pledge already. And obviously, these are basically the strategies that have been found in many different these studies. So this is Japan. It will follow a similar set of strategies. This is again the same message from other studies, but if you start looking at the energy or power generation mix, things will be more uncertain. So the scenarios are the same. So the default lower demand based on SSP2, and no CCS available and no nuclear available. And you see the power generation mix for 2050 from 5 models. You could argue the MHub might have a bit fairly high level of electricity generation. Aside from that, you can see a number of different power generation futures, and this is consistent with the previous EMF and other model interconnection projects. And of course, after the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear disaster, nuclear is a topic for huge controversy, and some people prefer non-nuclear future, or maybe others prefer actually some people still argue for the role of nuclear, but there are multiple futures, and it's up for a societal debate. So because we did a number of different scenarios, we wanted to summarize what's robust and what's uncertain. And here's one attempt. So so basically you see the carbon price average of 2020 to 2050, and for a number of different scenarios. I won't I wouldn't describe each scenario in detail, but for instance, this is the 26 emissions reduction, 26% reduction by 2030, and 1% reduction by 2050. And you can see no CCS, no nuclear, high VRE cost, and you can see a number of different scenarios here. The point of this figure is, if you look at this top part and bottom part, you can see the uncertain which parameter, which scenario affects the costs the most. And this is high stringent scenarios and low demand scenarios. We have scenarios with lower demands, and that are one of the most important factors to determine the cost of the deep mitigation. So we wanted to summarize this, and this is one attempt. So we decompose the uncertainty, actually the sum of squares, into those attributable to model, those attributable to scenario, and residuals or interaction. So here you see the CCS, the amount of CCS deployment. That's one of the most uncertain. Actually, each value is normalized by its value by its average value, so that we can meaningfully compare CCS, nuclear, VRE rate, and other cost parameters. Because otherwise, they each has different unit, and it's impossible to compare across variables. So under this normalized framework, so CCS is the most uncertain, followed by nuclear and VRE rate and cost. So this is another way to present the message I already conveyed you. So these are, if you go look at the bottom of this figure, energy intensity of GDP, the macro-wide energy efficiency, fossil fuel share, industry share in final energy. So these are these variables don't have a significant uncertainty. In other words, they are robust strategies for Japan to pursue. But when it comes to the CCS nuclear, depending on the scenario assumption and depending on the model, the deployment levels are so different, and that's these variables remain uncertain. So here, to summarize, robust mitigation strategies have been identified, and so this is basically repeating what a number of different studies have identified by the economy-wide efficiency, power sector decarbonization, electrification, and the area of uncertainties have been identified. So, and this implies a large innovation challenge, huge innovation challenges for Japan, and we haven't looked at the net zero emissions fully yet, but we did some analysis, and I think here here's one analysis. So you can look at which scenario is infeasible, and in some models the 90% emissions reduction, 90% emissions reduction, 100 emissions reduction, these scenarios are infeasible. Obviously, this is a model infeasibility, and actually a different version of these models show the feasibility of the deep decarbonization. So the interpretation of these figures are a bit complicated, but obviously we need more the clean energies. This is clean power generation sources, and the challenge will be bigger. And of course, we have to think about the negative emissions or CDR options as well. So I stop there, and thank you very much for listening.
That was a really nice presentation. I'm afraid that we have basically taken that part of our time, and I don't think we have one question, and if you can quickly answer this, it is, will Japan import hydrogen for carbon neutral, for meeting its carbon neutrality target in 2050?
Could you say that again? So we have to import hydrogen, and it depends on the model and scenario. But I think it doesn't have to be hydrogen. It could be biomass. But Japan will have to import clean energy source from abroad for sure, because we wouldn't be able to cover entire energy sources. Or maybe we can rely on nuclear, but the clean energy import or trade will be key component of our mitigation strategy.
Going now, we'll turn the floor over to Molly virtually.
Hi, my name is Molly, and today I'll be presenting some research on transport electrification in Pakistan. So this research was an effort between the Pacific Northwest National Lab, using the Global Change Analysis Model, as well as several modeling groups in Pakistan. So for some background on this work, Pakistan is one of many countries that's aiming to electrify its transport system. So last year, the government in Pakistan put out a draft National Electric Vehicle Policy, or an EVP, which set ambitious targets for EV adoption across all vehicle types over the next 20 years. And those are shown in the figure here. And it also proposed policy incentives, such as exemption from sales tax and registration fees, lower duties for EV imports, government procurement of electric bus and truck fleets, and expansion of public charging infrastructure. And some of the goals of the policy are to achieve climate mitigation targets, reduce air pollution in cities, reduce fossil fuel use and dependence on fuel imports, and promote the growth of a local EV manufacturing industry. So we use the Global Change Analysis Model, or GCAM, to model the incentives proposed in the NEVP, along with technological development pathways, to analyze drivers of EV adoption and cross-sectoral impacts. Our goal is to answer questions such as how effective are various policy instruments in incentivizing EV adoption, how sensitive is EV adoption to technology and cost development, what are the impacts on power supply requirements and fuel consumption, what are the impacts on transportation and power sector emissions, and then what lessons can Pakistan's EV adoption efforts provide for other developing countries, considering its susceptibility to global EV costs, as well as uncertainties in future growth and energy demands. So as I mentioned, this analysis was a collaboration with modeling groups in Pakistan, and this briefly describes how the models were linked. So although GCAM is the focus of this presentation, it was just one of several models used. So GCAM, as a global model that runs in 5-year time steps, doesn't have the capacity to model high-resolution load profiles or transmission and distribution systems, and also has some limitations for representing Pakistan-specific details. So considering this, we use GCAM to model the policy scenarios and come up with EV adoption rates by vehicle type, and also to explore high-level impacts on energy use and greenhouse gas and air pollutant emissions. And then collaborators from the Sustainable Energy for Pakistan project took those outputs and used them in a spreadsheet model to analyze hourly EV load profiles, annual electricity demands of EVs, and displacement of vehicle fuels under each scenario. And then based on the electricity demands, modelers at Pakistan's National Transmission and Dispatch Company used the Plexus power system model to look at the additional electrical capacity and generation needed to meet those demands, and the expected fuel mix. So for an overview of the GCAM scenarios, these were based on the proposed incentives under Pakistan's draft National Electric Vehicle Policy. So we modeled the policy cases by taking all of the monetary EV incentives together, which are implemented in GCAM through changes in vehicle costs. And the policy scenarios are translated into 3 different scenarios depending on assumptions on the localization of manufacturing. So because the policy aims to encourage the development of domestic EV manufacturing, incentives are higher for locally produced vehicles compared to imported vehicles. So we model the NEVP policies under 3 cases, and those are no localization of EV production, gradual localization, and accelerated localization. And because future battery technology remains pretty uncertain, we run the policy scenarios in combination with a slow and a rapid technology advancement case to represent the range of possibilities for future EV costs and energy intensities. And this gives us 8 scenarios, which are shown here. And this set of scenarios lets us explore separately the policy measures, the expansion of local manufacturing, and the exogenous EV cost improvements as drivers of adoption. So for a brief summary of the results, GCAM tracks vehicle vintages so we can explore the share of EVs in new sales and compare that with Pakistan's adoption targets. So we find that the incentives proposed in the NEVP can more than double EV adoption rates compared to the no policy case. However, adoption rates do vary widely by vehicle type. So the policy incentives are more effective at encouraging EV adoption for vehicles where EVs are already more cost competitive with internal combustion engine vehicles, like two-wheelers and smaller cars. So the NEVP incentives and localization on their own are sufficient to meet the 2030 targets for small vehicle classes, but it fails for buses and freight trucks. And the level of EV adoption for buses and trucks is much more dependent on the technology development pathway than the policy. And the target is also 90% of new sales for all vehicles by 2040, which we don't see for any of the vehicle classes. One other thing to note is that the NEVP benefits end after several years, which we also modeled here. So across all the vehicle classes, the share of EVs in new sales decreases after 2030. And one limitation of this is that Gcam doesn't capture feedbacks to vehicle costs that would result from higher adoption rates, like economies of scale. So this sharp drop after 2030 probably isn't completely realistic. And we also find that higher EV adoption reduces emissions from transportation, but increases emissions from electricity. And in Gcam, we adjusted Pakistan's projected power generation mix based on the government's most recent plans for expansion of capacity, which includes increased coal-fired generation. And so this higher carbon intensity of the electrical grid offsets some of the gains from EV adoption, although the net effect is still lower emissions. And while the transportation sector is a growing source of CO2 and non-CO2 emissions in Pakistan, it's still a relatively small share of the total. So in terms of climate mitigation, the levels of EV adoption that we see under these scenarios probably aren't as impactful as, for example, increasing renewable power generation, but it can provide some improvements for urban air quality. And these results also underscore the importance of considering policies to increase EV adoption together with policies to decarbonize the electricity system. And one other thing we want to explore more relating to the overall effect on emissions is how does government spending to incentivize EV adoption compare to savings on fuel imports and other downstream costs, like lower costs for healthcare and productivity resulting from lower emissions. So I'll also give a brief summary of some of the findings from the other models used. So in terms of energy supply chain impacts, the NEVP decreases gasoline and diesel imports, but increases natural gas and coal imports for electricity generation. And by 2030, the NEVP could save up to 6.8 terawatts. It could increase electricity consumption by up to 6.8 terawatt hours and save up to 1.5 million tons of fuel annually. But this depends on the scenario and the EV cost pathway. The higher efficiency of EVs also provides some economic benefits. From 2021 to 2030, Pakistan could save up to 1.3 billion in net fuel supplies. And the cost of additional power generation will be more than offset by the savings on vehicle fuel. So to recap, we modeled Pakistan's national electric vehicle policy in Gcam along with a range of future EV costs to explore the impact of policies and technology on EV uptake, energy supply chains, and emissions. And we found that the NEVP measures can help meet EV targets for some vehicles, while others are more dependent on the speed of battery technology advancement. And EV adoption can reduce greenhouse gas and air pollutant emissions, but the increased power sector emissions under Pakistan's planned generation mix can offset some of these benefits. And finally, reduced consumption of imported fuel and higher efficiency of EVs can provide economic benefits. Thank you, and I'm happy to take any questions.
So thank you, Molly. That was really nice, well timed. If you have, do you have any additional thoughts or comments that you would like to make in addition? Given that you're now live.
Yeah, I just want to also acknowledge the funders of this research, which was the U.S. Agency for International Development. And again, acknowledge the collaborators at the Sustainable Energy for Pakistan Project and the National Transmission and Dispatch Company.
Great. So are there any questions for Molly before we head on to our next session? I'm sorry, our next presentation. And you can put them in the Q&A if there are. Otherwise, I'm going to encourage people to put their Q&A into the Q&A chat, not to be confused with just plain chat. And we'll accumulate those, and I hope that we'll have a few minutes at the end for us to be able to have a more general discussion. But if I don't see any specific questions for Molly at this point, so our next presenter is Rafael, who's going to talk about the role of climate finance in national mitigation strategies and allocation effects on recipient economies. So let me turn the floor and the screen over to you, Rafael, please proceed.
Thanks, Jay. I'm sharing my screen right now. Good morning, good afternoon, everyone.
All right.
Okay, do you see the full screen? Okay, let's go.
We can. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Good evening, good afternoon, everyone. Good morning for those here in Brazil as well. Today I'm going to talk about the role of international climate finance flows in national mitigation strategies and the effects of allocation on recipient economies. This work is part of my doctoral thesis in energy planning at COPPE, Rio de Janeiro, Brazil. This presentation is structured in 4 parts, including a climate finance, then methods, some results, and final remarks. I will try to keep it within 10 minutes. So let's start with this little background on climate finance. There is a strong consensus in the literature that a variety of policy instruments, both at local and international levels, are actually required to promote low carbon transitions and to curb emissions, as represented here in this picture on the right. So as you can see here. And climate finance stands as one of these instruments, an instrument of climate policy, which includes the investments required to limit global warming and to adapt to climate change impacts. So in this paper, we focus solely on international climate finance flows that are in the context of the Paris Agreement. More specifically, we focus on the goal of transferring the $100 billion per year from developed to developing countries. And our literature review shows that there are few studies that assess the impacts of scaling up these climate finance flows. And the few studies that exist rely on effort sharing approaches, but they don't focus entirely on the effects on the recipient region. So this paper tries to fill this gap in the literature. And in this presentation, we will rely on 2 main research questions. The first one, what are the macroeconomic effects of scaling up international climate finance flows to the 100 billion commitment of the Paris Agreement? And the other one, how would different allocation schemes for international climate finance flows impact national mitigation strategies of these economies, the recipient economies, those that are receiving these flows? So moving to the methods, I'll show we relied on our global CG model, the total economy assessment model. It's a model with 18 regions represented with 21 sectors. The model relies on the GTAP and GAMS model, and it has a recursive dynamic setup, very flexible, that allowed us to represent these flows in the model. So in the first step of the research, we had a large data gathering process to identify these flows, and then to decouple these flows from the GTAP9 database, which is the database we use in our model. And in the second step, we transform these flows into a new form of capital. We call this green capital, that goes into the production function of this renewable technologies, wind, solar, hydro, biomass power generation, and also biofuels production. And this green capital is free to complement or fully substitute the traditional capital that is already represented in the model. As a result, we have a new capital structure for these sectors in each of the countries that are receiving these flows. I will briefly show our base year estimates for the for the data of international climate finance. On year 2011, we have a total amount of $25.8 billion from donor countries going to recipient countries in the model. Then these flows are scaled up to reach $100 billion in all scenarios, which I will present now, briefly describing the scenarios right now. So we have a baseline where these flows are not explicitly represented, and then we have 4 policy scenarios. The first one is climate finance scenario, where these flows are kept under the current allocation that they face right now. And meanwhile, the 3 other scenarios, we have some simulations to allocate these flows according to different criteria. And these are the criteria based on different quantitative index to allocate these flows according to these 3 scenarios, sorry. So we have a low emitter scenario, we have a development stage scenario that relies on GDP, and an early action scenario that relies on carbon market revenues indexes to reallocate these flows. Moving forward to our results of the effects of scaling up and allocating these flows. So I will start first talking about the macroeconomic results. Here we have the GDP by each of the 4 scenarios in 2040. And we see in this axis here the relative change to the baseline. We can see in the blue bars that there are gains found for the receiving regions. The regions are here in the x-axis, and these gains reach up to 3%, depending on the scenario and depending, of course, the region, which is quite substantial for some regions. In red, however, we have losses for the donor regions, which is expected, but these losses are not very substantial for more in particular for those regions that are the main donors, which are European Union and USA. And finally, we have also slight and positive effects on GDP as an overall result for the economy, if we account all the regions in this yellow bar here. Next, I'm going to talk about the renewable technology deployment. So moving forward to that, our results for the capital for renewables. Here I'm showing for the 4 scenarios how the green capital penetrates in the production function of these scenarios for the technologies I have shown you before, and this can be further explored, further understanding if we take a look at across the regional results. So in the next 4 slides, I will go across the four scenarios, but with a regional disaggregation. So we can see that there is an increase in an overall perspective, of course, that there's an increase of the green capital in these production functions, becoming the main source of this function, these sectors, these technologies, depending on the scenario, of course. And as a result, we can see here in this table, the renewables in some regions, we have selected regions right here, but we can see a greater deployment of renewables, be it renewable power generation technologies or biofuels as well. we can see a greater deployment of these technologies in some regions to the detriment of others. More specifically, we can see Brazil and South Africa facing stronger increases in renewable power generation and biofuels, and so on and so forth. And now looking at the mitigation effects, which is the second question I've shown you in my previous slides. Looking at mitigation effects, we can see here in the red lines the CO2 emissions from 2015 to 2040 by region and by scenario here in the rows. So these emissions are decoupled by the Kaya identity in the green, gray, and yellow bars, expressing structure, intensity, and activity effects. And we can see that the stronger deployment of these technologies has greater mitigation effects in South America in general, but particularly in Brazil, with CO2 emissions decreasing up to 6.5%, depending on the scenario and the year of the analysis. And we can see also that there are no effects in regions like China and in India. Meanwhile, we have intermediate effects in Africa and South Africa. Now moving to my final slide, my final remarks for this presentation. So the implications and contributions of this study, first, the international climate finance flows affect economic growth and welfare of the recipient regions. However, in terms of mitigation, there are different regional effects found. Regions like Brazil and South Africa benefit from international climate finance flows allocation, and CO2 emissions decrease because of changes mainly in the structure of power generation and biofuels consumption in these regions. And importantly, these results are in line with the literature with study by Roman and others, which identify that climate finance produces the largest domestic impacts in Brazil among a group of selected countries, Mexico, China, India, and others. However, we see no spillover effects registered in Africa and South Africa, so we don't see a lot of decrease in CO2 emissions in these regions. And we see, more importantly, negligible effects in terms of mitigation in India and China, which suggests that these regions that have low abatement costs options in our model, at least, might not be the best suited options for climate finance flows to be allocated to, if the expected outcome of the commitments of this transfer is to maximize global mitigation efforts. Finally, we have some limitations and suggestions for future studies that should include transaction costs that are not included in the model, specifically because we face a lot of principal agent problems when transferring these funds, this capital, and also the allocation of international climate finance flows to other activities and based on other indexes should be explored in further studies. I will stop here, and I would like to thank you very much.
Thank you. That was really nicely done. It was well timed and very informative. I'm going to try to get us through this quickly and then open the floor so we can have a discussion. As you can see that we have some questions emerging in the Q&A section, and so to the extent that you can answer, speakers can answer them in that format, we can have a continuing exchange of information, even as I'm interrupting everyone. Thank you very much. And let's see, we have two more presentations today, this morning for me, this evening for the Asians, and this afternoon for the Europeans. Our next one is Isabela on bioenergy and carbon capture and storage spatially explicitly modeled in Brazil. Isabela, are you able to share your screen and begin the presentation?
Thank you, Jay. I'm Isabela, and today I'm going to talk about the work that we have done in the past year in collaboration between COPPE in Brazil and PBL in the Netherlands, in modeling in a spatially explicit way bioenergy with carbon capture and storage. And today I'm going to focus on our case study for Brazil. Just so a little context and motivation for this work, you all have probably heard somewhere that bioenergy is expected to play an important role in climate mitigation efforts. We see that many different integrated assessment models will deploy bioenergy with and without carbon capture in many different scenarios in different levels. But most IAMs, they do not thoroughly reflect on regional specificities, for example, like the supply chain of biomass and the logistics. So it got us wondering, how realistic is that? And can we translate high-level integrated assessment models projections to a country or a regional level as a complementary type of analysis in order to provide more robust insights for climate mitigation strategies in the regional level and also for policy advice? So we started working on Bloom. Bloom is a perfect foresight, least cost optimization model. And what we are trying to account for with this model is, can you still see? Yeah. So it's biomass production, the impacts of biomass production, biomass transportation, biomass conversion, biofuels transportation, the carbon capture, transportation and storage network, and then also emissions, given that we apply a carbon tax. So how the modeling framework interacts with integrated assessment models, both global and national, mostly from bioenergy production targets, and then also parameters. And then the model optimizes and allocates crops, locates conversion facilities, and also works with cumulative land use change, emissions, costs, and etc. So the model can be applied to any region or specific country. And here we're going to show how we did it for Brazil. So for the Brazilian case study, we have 2,840 grid cells of 50 per 50 kilometers, and we are covering the period from 2020 to 2050. We're using bioenergy projections of production from the Brazilian land use and energy systems model that's called BLUES. It's our national integrated assessment model, and we are using the scenario for the Brazilian NDC. Then we're also covering different land availability scenarios. So for the first couple of scenarios, we're working with more restrictive land availability. So we're only accounting for other land and agricultural land. And here by agricultural land, we mean the share of agricultural land that is already being used to produce biofuels in Brazil, which is the case for sugarcane and for soybean, for example. And then we're also checking on the scenario with the carbon tax. And then we're moving on to include pasture recovery. And we are using the NDC target on pasture recovery. And we are also assessing we would call it a worst case scenario, where we would allow the model to also go into forest areas. So where we would have no forest protection. And then to see how the model will behave in those conditions. And then just to give an idea what the target for pasture recovery in the NDC is, so it's approximately 17 million hectares by 2030. So these are the bioenergy production targets that we're using. They are a result for the NDC scenarios from blues. And here we see the different technologies portfolios that we are using. For the NDC specifically, we do not have technologies with CCS, but as we are interested in also covering BACs, we decided to also run scenarios when we have a carbon tax, we also have CCS. And then for ethanol, first generation, we consider that half of the production will include CCS. And for biojet fuel and diesel biofuel, we consider that for the CCS carbon tax scenarios, all of it will be produced with CCS. So the first preliminary results, we see here the different allocations for the different crops. So we see how crops compete for land and how they are being currently allocated. These are the results for the most restrictive land availability scenarios, but we have, of course, similar results for all of the scenarios, and we can see how that allocation evolves through time. And then we also look into what it means in terms of land use. And here we see that the requirements for land will increase significantly from 2020 to 2050. And we see that when we include pasture recovery, the model will shift a little bit towards pastures, and especially moving from other lands to pastures when we apply a carbon tax. And we also see, unfortunately, that if we do not protect forests, the model will choose to go there. So we see here a significant amount of forest area loss, especially in the case without a carbon tax. And we see here that in the case with a carbon tax, it is a little less, but still, even though we have a carbon tax, it's still going there. And then in terms of total emissions, and here I'm showing the emissions for the scenario for the entire period, we see that, of course, the scenario where we allow for deforestation, the emissions are much higher. And we see that the scenarios with pasture recovery are performing better. And then to get a picture of where is this loss in forest area and what is happening there in those scenarios where we do not protect forests, we saw that we are not seeing that loss in forest area much in the Amazon forest region. So it's a lower expansion in the Amazon forest region, and that's due to a logistics effect. So instead, what we're seeing from the results and the spatially explicit allocation is that other biomes are being pressured and are at risk instead. So instead of the Amazon forest, we see a lot of loss in the Atlantic forest, which is much closer to the demand centers. And then just to give an idea on the carbon capture, transportation, and storage dimension, we can see here for ethanol first generation with CCS, where capacities are installed and to which storage sites they are connected, and how the system expands, for example, here from 2030 to 2050, how it deploys new capacities and retires others, and how and to where they are connected. So what we see from this study, what we understand from it, is that in the absence of policies and strategies to protect, and of course also to enforce protection of natural land areas and to prevent deforestation, if we do not have those policies, we see a considerable loss in forest area. So even when we applied a carbon tax, it wasn't enough to not see the forest being deforested. And then we also see that from a logistics perspective, in terms of costs and logistics constraints, the model is not posing too much of a threat to the Amazon forest, but it is endangering other biomes, which are just as important, like the Atlantic forest, for example. And even though pasture areas are not particularly attractive in those scenarios where there is no protection to forest areas, we see that it could improve land availability in no deforestation scenarios. So overall, we believe that this modeling framework and that this study is a step forward in moving from technical and sustainable potentials towards more feasible potentials regarding bioenergy, and also to get a better understanding of regional specificities that we are probably not able to see in national integrated assessment models, and even more in global integrated assessment models. So that's it, and thank you.
Right. I will briefly, I will speak about the EU 2030 targets and what impact different sub-targets for the effort sharing and the ETS targets and the ETS sectors will have. This is, wait, sorry, not working. Yes. So I adapt this when modeling meets actual national policies, because for me, this was the first work where we really get into close contact with EU and national policymakers. Before the last 10 years before that, I did IAM modeling on the global scale, sometimes looking into national numbers, but not really interacting with the policymakers. And so this was very intense and very interesting for me. And these are preliminary results, so they might change a bit, although we've tested quite a lot about them. So what the main aim is, how difficult is it to achieve the 2030 targets? I mean, the EU, you know, they're discussing the Green Deal, how that will be implemented, and the main part is to tighten the 2030 targets from -40% to -55%, so a substantial increase in ambition. With difficult in this question, we mean, what are the required CO2 prices, which show the marginal mitigation costs in our model? And we, as said before, look at the impact of different splits of these additional reductions, whether they come from the emissions trading system, ETS, which contains electricity and large industries, or from the effort sharing regulation sectors, the ESR sectors. So that's transport and buildings and small scale industry. We use scenario-based analysis with two numerical models, the IAM Remind EU and a dedicated power sector industry model, LIMES EU. The scenario dimensions I will present here are the two different targets, so either -40 or -55% in 2030, and the two different splits. First of all, when we look at the tightened 2030 targets, how do they agree with climate neutrality in 2050? And so we did our model runs with Remind EU, and you see here the total greenhouse gas emissions of the EU over the next decades. And as you can see, the upper black line, that is the current target, go through -40% in 2030, and then it stays above zero. And we see that our scenarios where we implement this -55% target and then a continual default increase of CO2 prices, we hit our net neutrality target that is already decided upon. What are the marginal abatement costs in 2030 if we don't add additional policies, but rather do it just through carbon pricing on top of what we currently have as additional policies? So first, we looked at the current -40% target of -40%. And we see, so here you have different sub-targets for the effort sharing regulation sectors and the ETS. And you see in the model, you need CO2 prices in the range of 30 to 60 euros to reach the ETS targets, and 100 to 200 euros to reach the effort sharing regulation targets. Now, if you ask, why do we have a range of CO2 prices? Well, we use several models, and we did a number of sensitivity runs because there are many uncertain parameters. And so we scanned a few of them. And this is the range that we came up with. As a further plausibility check, we compared the CO2 prices for the effort sharing regulation sectors, which we calculated with the ones that are in the official studies from the German ministries, because these targets, they are in their actual law. So Germany needs to achieve the underlying effort sharing regulation targets. So there are many studies from the ministries, and they say that CO2 prices in the range of 100 to 140 euros per ton of CO2 are needed to reach the 2030 targets, but they also assume strong additional measures on top of what's currently implemented, which we don't do. So I think our range of 100 to 200 is broadly consistent with that. Now, if we go from the current minus 40% target to minus 55, we can either do the additional reductions in the ETS or in the effort sharing regulation. And if we first continue the current split that we see in the current target, then we get two new targets for the effort sharing and ETS sectors. And we see that in the model, we need 350 to 500 euros per ton of CO2 in 2030 to achieve the effort sharing, and 80 to 150 for the ETS. If we instead put everything in the ETS, we see similar prices across the two different systems, namely 120 to 300 or 150 to 300. So this would be, in a way, the economically optimal solution. You have similar marginal abatement costs in the two sectors. Now, this is interesting results from our model, but how do they compare to other analyses that are out there? And over the summer, the EU Commission brought out the impact assessment, calculated mostly from the primes model, and the C price scenario, which is a scenario that focuses mostly on carbon prices. They have very few additional policies, but very little on top of what's currently there. And that is directly comparable to what we have. And if we look at that, we see they say in the baseline, you need CO2 prices of 30 euros. And in the C price scenario, so that's tightening the emission to similarly like ours to minus 55%, they need about 60 euros per ton of CO2. Our numbers are similar in baseline, a bit higher, but similar, and substantially higher in the C price scenario. So the lower bound factor of 2 larger, the upper bound a factor of 5. Now, if you dig into the results from this EU impact assessment scenarios, you can see one interesting thing that quite surprised me. These are the emission reductions versus up here versus 1990, and down here versus 2015. And you see in which sectors you see additional emission reductions versus the baseline. And you see substantial emission reductions in the building sector. So going from minus 47 to 61, so that's roughly 13 percentage points additional reductions. And this all coming about only because of 60 euros per ton of CO2. Well, I mean, they have a model, we have a model. Nobody knows what's the right model. So the next step to do is try to do a bottom-up plausibility check. So what are the effects of CO2 price in buildings? You can look at how do they change energy and technology costs. One of the key low carbon options, if you want to decarbonize buildings, are heat pumps, replace gas boilers by heat pumps. And if you then do some bottom-up calculations, life cycle, full life costs, you come out with numbers like 150 euros per ton of CO2, at which the full life costs for a gas boiler would be the same like those for a heat pump. This is now done for Germany, but you can do similar calculations for other EU countries. This means your gas price would increase by roughly 3 cents per kilowatt hour, which means your annual gas bill increases by 600 euros per ton of CO2. And if you would have these 150 euros per ton of CO2, half of the people who buy a new boiling system, a new heating system, would go for heat pumps. Half of them would go to gas boilers if they are only going by prices. However, that's the long-term equilibrium solution you get. If we're thinking of what happens in the next 10 years, we are in a really tough transition period. And so we say it's quite likely that the same CO2 price brings us lower reductions in this transition period. There are a few reasons for this. For example, as said, the CO2 price would increase your gas bill by 600 euros. Investing into a new heat pump costs you 18,000 euros. And who buys a new heat pump for 18,000 euros just because your gas bill goes up a little bit? So very likely people only do that if you're building a new house or if you have to replace a broken heater. So that shrinks drastically the amount of people who react to the CO2 price in the building sector. Secondly, we're looking at the next 10 years where people should change their heaters in order to have lower emissions in 2030, because not everybody does that in 2030. And over the next 10 years, you will have lower CO2 prices. And then the question is, how sure are you that you will see these high CO2 prices in 2030? And not, for example, higher electricity prices, as we've seen over the last decade, where they continually went up by 5% per year in Germany. And thirdly, even if you are, as a person, really convinced that you want to get a heat pump, you first need to find somebody who can sell it to you and who can put it into your house. And at least in Germany, there's a very limited number of craftsmen and planners who really know heat pumps and know how to design them. And there are many plumbers, you ask them, they say, no, I have no idea. I can build your gas boiler because I've done that for 30 years, but I don't have the capacity to build heat pumps. So this is another bottleneck that really is important for this transition period until 2030. So going back to the comparison, I would say I find it implausible that this 13% percentage points reduction of emissions in buildings will come about just by 60 euros per ton CO2. We spoke with representatives from DG Energy, DG Klima, and they said, well, a lot of these reductions come from expansion of district heating, which is another very prominent option. But I would ask the question, is it likely that you get a substantial expansion of district heating without any additional policies, just a CO2 price? And who takes these massive investments, opening all the roads and putting new district heating pipelines, just because you expect in 5 or 10 years, your gas price will be a little bit higher? That I would say there's quite a risk on that. So with this very detailed look, let's take one step back and like look at the larger messages of this. So I said the minus 55% target implies a fundamental change over a short period. And in this short period, there are many impeding factors, which mean that higher CO2 prices are necessary to achieve a given emission reduction than in the long-term equilibrium. You have, on the first part, uncertainty about the political commitment to targets. Will you invest as an investor now? Are you convinced that the EU Commission and that the national governments will stick to very tight targets in 2030, 2040, 2050, especially if CO2 prices potentially rise very strongly? Or do you think at some point of time they say, well, we don't want to endanger our economies, so they drop it? And just to say, I mean, all these results were calculated with Remind, which is intertemporally optimizing, as most IAMs or many IAMs. So it knows future CO2 prices increase without uncertainty. Most investors don't. They don't intertemporally optimize, and they don't know what the CO2 price will be in the future. Because the next big problem is, how does your national emission target translate into CO2 prices? And that's the only thing that matters for an investor. I don't care as an investor if I know Germany may still emit 200 megatons in 2040, because I have no idea how much anybody else will emit. For me, it's only important what's the CO2 price. And then if I have our study saying 200, 300, and you have the EU study saying 60, that is quite a large uncertainty. This is even way worse or more problematic, that if you invest now, you need to know carbon prices until 2040 to be sure that you make a good investment. So like to make this a bit more tangible, this is CO2 prices in the EU ETS over the last 10 years until 2020. And then just assuming they increase to 50 euros per ton to CO2 in 2025. Now, if I'm standing at this point, 2025, and I have to invest, what do I think will the future CO2 price be? I could have investing according to current price, so this lower line here, because that was quite a good heuristic in the past. Or I could assume this one, which is this, the EU emission impact assessment. If I just linearly extend that, I would be here. If I take our Remind values, I would be up in this range. And I mean, we all clearly see that if you think this is a future CO2 price, you will invest very differently than if you think this is the future CO2 price. So this expectation about future CO2 prices, which is taken as a given in most of our models, is really important for the success of real-world policies. On top of that, there are additional things that make this transition period more difficult. They all imply very high risk markups for investors now into new technologies, be it hydrogen for steel, be it electric lorries, and so on. So they all hinder this transformation phase. But they are enabling policy instruments which can address these impeding factors and thereby facilitate the transformation. They are not new, but they have to be implemented and implemented well. So if the central aim is to reduce risk markups, we have these impeding factors I just spoke about. You have things you can do against this. For the uncertainty about political commitment, a climate law with binding intermediate targets definitely will reduce this uncertainty. For the future CO2 prices, a really important step is to introduce floor carbon prices. So say in our ETS, as long as the carbon price is below a certain value, we don't sell new certificates. And based on our analysis, we would say we need a floor carbon price of more than 100 euros per ton of CO2. Otherwise, we can forget the 55% target for 2030. And then there are financing guarantees, technology support, etc. You could also look at the effort sharing regulation sectors, buildings and transport, where you have many additional problems in this transition phase, principal agent problem, hand-egg problem for infrastructure, etc. You also need to address all of these in order that the CO2 price that we all have in our models and that all have very large effects in our models, that they really appear for the customer as something to act upon. So yes, let me jump to the conclusion. In order to achieve 55 emission reductions, mainly through CO2 prices, our modeling says we need 120 to 300 euros per ton of CO2 in 2030. If the ETS sectors do most of the additional reductions, if we have, as currently, quite substantial additional reductions in the effort sharing regulation sectors, then you need even higher prices in the range of 300 to 500 euros. Based on this, we that the C price results of the impact assessment of the EU seem very optimistic, and that they actually could endanger the transformation because investors will not invest if they believe in 60 euros per ton of CO2 in 2030. There are many impeding factors that slow this transformation phase until 2030. However, many enabling policy instruments can address these impeding factors and increase the effect that CO2 prices have, and thereby facilitate the transformation. And the most crucial part among these enabling factors is, in my view, to stabilize the expectation of high long-term CO2 prices, e.g. by setting a floor price in the ETS and effort sharing regulation sectors. Thanks very much. And if you have further questions, I'm also in the poster session later with half of this paper, so to say. So we can very well discuss this later if time is short now. Thanks.